From the outside, life inside North Korea appears orderly. Streets are swept clean. Portraits hang undisturbed. Traffic flows in slow, deliberate patterns. For a foreign visitor, especially one operating under official pretense, the first impression is not chaos, but choreography. Every movement feels arranged. Every interaction has edges. And within that careful staging, the American agent begins to understand that survival will not depend on boldness, but on restraint. He is never alone. From the first morning, a handler is assigned to him, a courteous, well-dressed official whose presence is framed as hospitality. The role is described as guidance, assistance, translation. In practice, it is surveillance softened by politeness. The handler accompanies him to meetings, to meals, to cultural sites carefully selected to reflect pride and progress. Even routine walks are subtly redirected. A turn down the wrong street is gently corrected. A lingering glance at an unfinished building is met with a patient explanation. The message is consistent. There is nothing here you need to see that we have not already prepared for you. Over time, he begins to map the invisible boundaries. Certain questions produce rehearsed answers. Others produce silence. There are topics that shift the air in a room: food shortages, military deployments, border controls. The shift is small but perceptible. Shoulders stiffen. Smiles tighten. Teacups pause midair. He learns to retreat before the silence becomes suspicious. Curiosity in this environment is a liability. Public spaces are the regime's theater. Schools display disciplined students reciting achievements. Factories operate with synchronized precision during scheduled visits. Apartment blocks shown to foreigners are immaculate, their interiors curated with framed photographs and polished floors. But beyond those guided corridors, the agent notices subtle inconsistencies. Streetlights dim earlier in certain districts. Power flickers unpredictably. Markets operate in corners with an urgency that feels unofficial. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they accumulate. Intelligence work here is not about stolen documents or secret recordings. It is about patterns, what is shown, what is concealed, and what accidentally reveals itself in between. Conversations are conducted in layers. The agent maintains a persona built carefully before arrival: professional, respectful, mildly inquisitive, but never probing. His background has been constructed to justify his presence, and he inhabits it fully. He laughs at appropriate moments. He expresses admiration where expected. He participates in ceremonies with convincing solemnity. Performance becomes routine. Over months, routine becomes muscle memory. Yet beneath the surface, his attention never relaxes. Military officers at state functions drink more heavily than protocol suggests. Mid-level officials speak cautiously but hint at frustrations masked as jokes. A comment about agricultural yields carries a trace of apology. None of these moments are explosive. None would justify alarm on their own. But together they form a quiet undercurrent, a sense that the image projected outward requires constant maintenance. The greatest pressure does not come from dramatic confrontations. It comes from duration. Days become weeks. Weeks become seasons. Each morning requires the same calibration. How much enthusiasm is believable? How much neutrality is safe? Even fatigue must be managed. Exhaustion, if visible, invites questions. Questions invite scrutiny. Scrutiny invites risk. So he develops rituals to preserve control. Early rising, measured exercise, mental rehearsals of cover details. He repeats key elements of his false biography until they feel indistinguishable from memory. The human mind adapts, but not without cost. There are moments, usually late at night, when the performance begins to blur. In his assigned residence, comfortable by local standards but monitored, he allows himself stillness. He reviews observations mentally, organizing them into categories: infrastructure, morale, supply chains, rhetoric shifts. Without secure communication, much of this intelligence must be stored internally, waiting for transmission windows that are infrequent and tightly controlled. The burden of memory becomes heavy. Forgetting is not an option. Isolation compounds the strain. True privacy does not exist. Walls may contain listening devices. Domestic staff report irregularities. Even casual remarks can be relayed upward through channels invisible to him. As a result, silence becomes his refuge. He speaks less than necessary. He reveals nothing uncalculated. Over time, this guardedness extends beyond professional necessity. It begins to alter his sense of self. Living under surveillance produces a particular kind of erosion. Identity, normally reinforced by honest interaction, is replaced by projection. He cannot share fear. He cannot display doubt. Even mild irritation must be disguised. The persona he constructed to survive begins to dominate his interior life. When he recalls home, the memories feel distant, as though belonging to someone else. Birthdays pass unacknowledged. Political changes abroad filter in through state media, distorted and reframed. The outside world becomes abstract, and yet he continues to gather fragments. He notices which military units are praised most frequently in official broadcasts. He tracks changes in fuel availability by observing vehicle traffic patterns. He studies the tone of national celebrations, comparing them year to year. Incremental details form a slow, disciplined accumulation of insight. The regime's facade remains intact, but hairline cracks appear in repetition. A slogan emphasized too aggressively suggests insecurity. A public absence hints at internal reshuffling. Years pass in this measured tension. Suspicion never announces itself loudly. Instead, it manifests in subtle recalibrations. A new handler rotates into his orbit, less conversational than the last. Meeting approvals take longer. Invitations become more formal. None of these shifts confirm danger, but each requires adjustment. He reduces unnecessary movement. He tightens his language further. Survival is not about eliminating risk, it is about keeping it within manageable margins. Psychological strain becomes the defining adversary. There are no visible enemies, only the persistent awareness that exposure would not result in negotiation. It would result in disappearance. Detention facilities are rarely acknowledged publicly, but their existence is understood. Foreign nationals who violate expectations do not receive public trials in the way Western audiences might imagine. Outcomes are opaque. That opacity sustains discipline. Despite everything, he does not grow reckless. If anything, he becomes more patient. Intelligence gathered slowly tends to endure scrutiny. Impulsive action would undo years of careful positioning. So he waits, observes, endures. By the 6th year, the rhythm that once felt suffocating has become familiar. Familiarity does not equal comfort, but it does allow efficiency. He understands the cadence of official statements. He anticipates which cultural events will be emphasized. He reads faces with greater precision. The system around him remains rigid, but within its rigidity, he finds predictable contours. What he sacrifices, however, is less visible. The longer he lives within a constructed identity, the more difficult it becomes to separate performance from authenticity. The mask, once worn deliberately, begins to adhere. Survival demands this compromise. Reflection is postponed. Doubt is compartmentalized. Inside North Korea, tension rarely explodes. It lingers. It presses gently but constantly, like atmospheric pressure at depth. The agent endures it not through heroics, but through discipline. Each uneventful day is, in its own quiet way, a success. And in that accumulation of controlled days, the mission continues, unseen, uncelebrated, and always one mistake away from ending. The first lesson he learns inside North Korea is that nothing is accidental. The timing of meetings, the routes taken through the city, the faces that appear repeatedly in different rooms, each detail carries intention. Even the weather briefings on state television feel curated, as though the atmosphere itself must align with the narrative of control. For a man trained to detect patterns, the country presents itself as a living diagram of authority. His handler greets him each morning with polite consistency. The tone is warm but measured, friendly without familiarity. The role is described as assistance, yet its boundaries are unmistakable. Travel requires approval. Schedules are prearranged. Spontaneous curiosity is gently redirected. When he expresses interest in a district not listed on the itinerary, the response arrives wrapped in courtesy but reinforced by refusal. Over time, he understands that the handler is not merely supervising logistics. He is observing deviations. The city of Pyongyang unfolds like a stage set. Wide boulevards stretch across monumental architecture. Murals celebrate industrial triumphs and military strength. School children move in organized lines, their uniforms immaculate. To a visiting delegation, it is a portrait of discipline. But discipline at this scale requires maintenance, and maintenance leaves traces. He notices the intervals between buses are longer than the official schedule suggests. He observes construction sites where progress appears frozen, cranes suspended in stillness for weeks. These are not dramatic revelations. They are quiet contradictions, small misalignments between image and infrastructure. His work depends on collecting such misalignments without appearing to collect them. He asks questions sparingly, phrased in ways that flatter rather than challenge. He listens more than he speaks. At state dinners, he studies seating arrangements and who avoids eye contact when certain topics arise. Military officers drink cautiously but steadily, their laughter slightly delayed when praise for leadership grows too elaborate. In factories prepared for foreign tours, managers recite production figures with confidence, yet their hands reveal tension, fingers tightening around clipboards. Months pass in measured repetition. The sameness is deliberate. Predictability reinforces authority. Yet for him, predictability becomes camouflage. Within routine, he identifies safe spaces for observation. A recurring agricultural briefing reveals subtle shifts in emphasis from abundance to resilience. Resilience, he notes internally, is often invoked when scarcity is close enough to acknowledge but too distant to admit. State newspapers adjust phrasing around trade partnerships, celebrating self-reliance while quietly referencing external support. Each linguistic change becomes a data point stored carefully in memory. True privacy never materializes. His residence, though comfortable by local standards, carries the faint hum of unseen monitoring. Electrical outlets seem slightly misaligned. Maintenance workers arrive without prior notice, efficient and expressionless. He assumes every room is compromised. This assumption shapes his behavior more than any visible threat. He avoids speaking aloud when alone. He writes nothing sensitive. Observations are cataloged internally, rehearsed mentally each night to prevent erosion. Memory becomes both vault and burden. Psychological strain accumulates gradually. The persona he presents is steady, respectful, professionally engaged. It has been crafted through months of preparation before his arrival. Now it must function without interruption. Fatigue cannot show. Frustration must be converted into polite curiosity. Even silence must appear thoughtful rather than evasive. The effort is constant. Over time, the distinction between performance and authenticity begins to blur. He catches himself reacting instinctively in ways that align with his cover rather than his convictions. Isolation deepens the erosion. Communication with the outside world is infrequent and heavily filtered. News arrives distorted through official channels, reframed to reinforce ideological narratives. Events back home feel distant, almost fictional. The longer he remains, the more abstract his previous life becomes. Birthdays pass without acknowledgement. Familiar routines from another continent fade into indistinct recollections. In their place stands a carefully maintained identity that cannot falter. The regime's control operates not through overt intimidation alone, but through omnipresence. Uniformed officers stand at intersections, posture rigid. Portraits of leadership watch from every interior wall. Loudspeakers broadcast patriotic music that drifts through public squares. The repetition is relentless, yet normalized. For residents, it forms the backdrop of existence. For him, it is a continuous reminder that deviation carries consequence. He has studied those consequences in briefings before deployment. Detention facilities, interrogations, forced confessions. The knowledge remains theoretical, but its possibility shapes every decision. Over the years, his understanding of the system grows more nuanced. He recognizes that not all officials are ideologues. Some appear motivated by survival rather than devotion. Subtle expressions, a delayed nod, a carefully chosen adjective, hint at internal complexities rarely visible to outsiders. These human moments complicate the narrative he carried with him. The country is neither monolithic nor chaotic. It is structured hierarchical and sustained by a mixture of belief, fear, and pragmatism. Small changes signal larger movements. A senior military figure once prominently featured in broadcasts disappears from coverage. Infrastructure projects shift priority without explanation. Fuel shortages manifest in quieter streets at dusk. None of these developments confirm instability, but together they suggest pressure beneath the surface. He tracks these indicators patiently, resisting the urge to interpret them prematurely. Intelligence work here is an exercise in restraint. Certainty is dangerous, probability is safer. As the 6th year approaches, time itself alters his perception. The rhythm that once felt suffocating now feels structured. He anticipates seasonal ceremonies, predicts policy emphasis based on historical anniversaries. Familiarity reduces overt anxiety, yet it introduces a subtler risk, complacency. He counters it with deliberate vigilance, reviewing his cover story nightly, refining details to maintain consistency. Even minor discrepancies could invite scrutiny from officials trained to detect irregularity. The greatest threat remains invisible. Suspicion does not arrive dramatically. It seeps in through altered tones, extended pauses, reassigned handlers. When a new supervisor begins attending meetings unannounced, he adjusts without hesitation. He reduces unnecessary commentary. He shortens engagements. Adaptation is survival. Each uneventful day confirms that the balance still holds. Yet the cost is internal. Living a lie for years reshapes cognition. He evaluates every thought before it surfaces. Emotional responses are filtered through calculation. Over time, he wonders which impulses belong to him and which belong to the role. The distinction matters less for mission success than for personal coherence. Still, he cannot afford introspection that distracts from discipline. North Korea remains outwardly stable, its facades intact, its ceremonies uninterrupted. Beneath that stability, he continues to gather fragments, economic strain, military posture, shifts in rhetoric, assembling them into a mental archive awaiting transmission. There are no dramatic confrontations, no cinematic escapes. There's only endurance, patience, and the quiet understanding that exposure would not result in negotiation, but erasure. In this environment, survival is defined not by bold action, but by sustained control. Each day concludes without incident, and that absence of incident becomes its own measure of success. The tension never disappears. It settles into the background like distant static. He learns to function within it, to let it sharpen, rather than paralyze. And so the years accumulate, steady and deliberate, as he remains behind enemy lines, observing, adapting, and preserving the fragile equilibrium that keeps him alive. By the 6th year, time no longer feels like a measurement. It feels like a weight. Days do not pass so much as accumulate, stacking quietly on top of one another until the distinction between beginning and middle disappears. The agent has adapted to North Korea's rhythms so completely that they now dictate his internal clock. Morning broadcasts cue his waking. Scheduled inspections define his movements. National holidays mark the seasons more clearly than weather ever could. What once felt foreign has become familiar, and that familiarity unsettles him more than the surveillance ever did. 6 years inside an authoritarian system does not simply test loyalty to a mission. It reshapes perception. He has grown accustomed to portraits watching from every wall, to rehearsed applause echoing in vast assembly halls, to the controlled cadence of official speech. The environment's rigidity has seeped into him. He notices it in his posture, in the way he pauses before speaking even when alone. Discipline has become instinct. But endurance carries its own strain. Extraction was always described as conditional, dependent on geopolitical climate, dependent on risk assessment, dependent on opportunity. In the early years, that conditional nature felt distant, almost theoretical. There was work to focus on, routines to master, patterns to track. Now, as political conditions shift beyond his control, uncertainty grows more pronounced. Signals from outside arrive, less frequently. Communications feel delayed, constrained by calculations he cannot see. He understands the logic. Missions evolve, priorities change, but understanding does not quiet doubt. Subtle signs of scrutiny begin to surface. A routine meeting is postponed without explanation. A handler who once shared mild personal anecdotes becomes strictly procedural. Background checks are reframed as administrative updates. None of these shifts confirm suspicion, yet together they form a tightening perimeter. He responds by narrowing his behavior further. Fewer questions, shorter engagements, an almost studied predictability. North Korea itself feels different. Economic strain is more visible now, even within curated districts. Power outages linger longer into the evening. Fuel conservation announcements grow more frequent. Military rhetoric intensifies in tone, emphasizing vigilance and sacrifice. International tensions ripple through state media with renewed urgency. These changes complicate his calculations. Political volatility can create opportunity, but it can also create scapegoats. He begins to evaluate the unspoken question that has hovered at the edge of his thoughts for months: remain longer or prepare to leave if a window opens. Remaining offers continuity. Years of positioning have granted him access to subtle but valuable insight. Departing prematurely could forfeit that access. Yet staying increases exposure. Time, once his ally, now magnifies risk. Patterns that once concealed him might eventually reveal him. the psychological toll becomes harder to compartmentalize. Fatigue is no longer temporary, it is structural. Maintaining a constructed identity for 6 uninterrupted years demands constant vigilance. There are moments when he catches himself struggling to recall which anecdote belongs to his cover and which belongs to his real past. The blending is dangerous. Precision must be absolute. Even a minor inconsistency could invite deeper review from authorities trained to notice anomalies. Sleep offers little relief. Dreams are fragmented, often silent. In them, he moves through familiar streets that shift without warning into foreign corridors. Waking feels less like return and more like continuation. The line between performance and self has thinned to translucence. He reminds himself that this erosion was anticipated in training, that psychological drift is a known hazard. Knowing this does not prevent it. Then, quietly, an opportunity presents itself. It is not dramatic. There are no coded phrases exchanged in shadowed rooms. Instead, it emerges through bureaucratic routine. A regional conference abroad is announced, requiring limited foreign participation under controlled supervision. His professional profile aligns plausibly with attendance. Approval would involve layers of clearance, but would also provide the first legitimate exit pathway in years. The proposal is introduced to him as routine, almost incidental. He recognizes its fragility immediately. Approval could be rescinded without explanation. Additional escorts could be assigned. Travel conditions could shift in response to political developments. Even if departure occurs, re-entry to North Korea would likely be restricted. The mission, as it has existed for 6 years, would effectively conclude. He requests consideration with measured neutrality, careful not to appear eager. Inside, calculations accelerate. Extraction under official cover reduces suspicion, but it does not eliminate risk. Authorities may scrutinize his activities more closely in the weeks preceding departure. Any irregularity now could jeopardize everything. He tightens his discipline further, reviewing every prior interaction for potential vulnerabilities. As preparations move forward, the atmosphere around him feels denser. Handlers review schedules with unusual thoroughness. Administrative reviews extend late into the evening. He interprets this not necessarily as suspicion, but as systemic caution. In a state built on control, departures are as controlled as arrivals. During his final weeks, he observes the city with altered awareness. Streets he once studied for inconsistencies now appear layered with memory. The monument-lined boulevards, the